All right, good evening. We're so glad that you're all here. I am Brooke Clement. I'm the director here at the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library and Museum, which is part of the National Archives and Records Administration. It's my pleasure to welcome you tonight, especially given all that we have going on right now. Before we continue, can you please ensure that your cell phones are turned off or on silent? Silent, please. So tonight, we are so pleased to be debuting our latest exhibit, Ford at 50, Decisions That Defined a Presidency. A lot of work went into this fantastic exhibit by our supervisory curator, Morel Lukey, our deputy director, Joel Westfall, our museum and archival teams, both here and in Ann Arbor, and our terrific contractor support staff. So we are hoping you find this exhibit as terrific as we all do here. I'd also like to point out a few new items on our walls. We hope you enjoy too, and maybe you've already seen some of those. The addition of some beautiful Kennerly photographs along the first floor walls. And to my right are some impressive photographs of President and Mrs. Ford that we recently added to our auditorium here that the Karsh estate permitted us to use, and just beautiful. I truly want to thank our wonderful partners at the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation, as well as all of you for your continued support of our library and museum. We would absolutely not be here tonight without that. So thank you so much. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Gleaves Whitney, the executive director of the foundation. Thank you.
Brooke, thanks so much for that introduction and those words, which I think sets the tone, along with the clip from Nixon's resignation speech. What a time to be alive then and now, to see 50 years later the consequences of that decision, and the reason that we're here tonight because of a remarkable human being who had the opportunity, through the terms of the 25th Amendment and his own talent, his ability to reach and connect with people across this country and across the world, rise to be in the White House, to the benefit of us all. So I want to thank Brooke and her staff, and also a special shout out to somebody from the National Archives who's with us. I don't see Monica Woods. Oh, there, Monica. Monica is the Chief of Staff to the Archivist of the United States. We welcome you, and we hope you'll come back frequently here. This is your first trip to Grand Rapids. We hope you'll be back many more times, Monica. This Ford 50th anniversary kickoff is a really important statement. We all got together over the past 3-4 years, and we decided it's very important that we make a strong statement because of what this country is going through. As everybody here knows, you don't need a lecture from me about it, we are in such a hyper-partisan, polarized time that has been difficult, I think, for every conscientious citizen in this country, no matter what your political affiliation, or if you have no political affiliation. It's just been a difficult time. So you're at the right place for us to discuss and explore what it means to maybe restore some sanity to our civic marketplace, to government. Over the next 895 days, that was the length of the Ford presidency, this foundation, this library, this museum, we are going to be exploring the meaning of the Ford presidency, the significance of the Ford presidency to U.S. history and to world history. I think that the way I summarize it to visitors of the museum is I think that President Ford, and I summarize it this way. Let me back up and just say, we have so many visitors who come here every year, and we give tours. It's one of the highlights of our work is to give tours and to watch the responses of people who come into this space, this civic temple to our democracy, and to watch them be transformed. And they'll then say, after spending 30, 40, 50 minutes with the exhibits, they'll come out and they'll look at you with a wistful look, and they'll say, where is Jerry Ford today? Where is a First Lady Betty Ford today? How do we recover and make possible that such fine people can be the leaders of the United States again? So the way I put it, after talking to hundreds and hundreds of people, visitors. You know, President Ford was the necessary man to lead our nation in the 1970s, and I would argue he's the indispensable statesman that we need today in the 2020s. You know, an operation like this requires a lot of people to pull this off. Brooke has already mentioned the fine staffs who've made this such a great opportunity for all of us who work here to share some things with you. I'd like to thank all the Ford family members who are here. Raise your hand if you're a Ford. And even if you're a Lincoln, you can raise your hand too. That's right, over here. We got the stronghold right over there. Raise your hand if you're a Ford Foundation trustee. Okay, I see the chair, Dave Hugendorn. Yes, other trustees, former trustees. Thank you all for being here. Maria, thank you. Raise your hand if you're a public servant or in the election cycle. Okay, very good. Yes, over in Ann Arbor. Yes, very good. Thank you very much for being here. I wish more of your colleagues would come here. I think they need what we teach. And I'm so pleased for all the friends of Ford. You know, year in and year out, you've stuck with us. We took a battering during COVID. It's no secret. I think all the organizations, civic organizations, took a battering. But you guys have stuck with us. We're growing the numbers again. We're so proud of our friends of Ford who come in event after event. So thank you very much for your support. Now, just a little bit of the run of show before I invite Steve Ford to come forward. Steve Ford's the third son of the President and Mrs. Ford, and he's been an actor, by the way, more than 800 hours in film and TV, and his stories are just amazing. He's very funny about it, humble about it. He got his start, he was a rodeo cowboy, and he got his start because a movie needed somebody who could fall off a horse to do a Western. So Steve's gonna come up here. There aren't any horses, Steve, but we know that you will do a great job with a PowerPoint here in just a moment. Steve's program will go about 30, 35 minutes. He's going to talk about his dad, in a very personal way, significant way. It's very interesting, compelling in a way that only he and Mike and Susan and Jack can talk about this. And then after that, we're going to bring up some of the great people to talk about the significance of the Ford administration. So joining Steve will be Mike Ford, Carla Hills, and Al Zapanta. And that'll be, as I say, in about 30, 35 minutes. And then after that, we will open it up. After we have some conversation, some questions, we'll open it up to you to ask questions. And then after that, we will repair over to the marble staircase over here. And we'll have a ribbon cutting to the wonderful new exhibit. And that exhibit is called Ford at 50, Decisions That Defined a Presidency. So it's going to be a great evening. Thank you for being here. Steve Ford, please join us. Give him a hand.
Thank you very much, Gleaves. Gosh, someone asked me on the way kind of to get here, does it make you sad to come to your dad and mom's museum where they're buried out here? And no, it makes me really happy because I don't care whether you like Dad's politics or don't like his politics. I can tell you he was a great father, and that was the greatest value to us. And when I was at the state funeral and I saw his casket go by and the trumpets and the flags and all the ceremony, when I looked at him, it wasn't what he did to get the troops out of Vietnam, cut inflation, heal from Watergate, all those things. That was not his greatest value to me at that time. His greatest value to me at that time was how he led our family as a father, how he showed us how to be a husband, how he showed us, you know, to lead a family. And so that, to me, is the greatest value my dad ever gave me. So Gleaves has asked me tonight to sort of fill in a little background. My job's easy. I'm the setup person for this fine panel you have right here. I'm going to kind of give you a few details about Dad's life, and then they're going to fill in all the blanks. And the question we're asking tonight is, how did Jerry Ford get to the White House? That's a question I always ask, how did he get to the presidency? This is a picture of our family back in 1975, 50 years ago, when we were on the cover of Time magazine. And thankfully, my brother Mike and I were talking, and I think Michael will agree with me. Thankfully, Dad left us the answers to that question. How did he get to the White House? How did he get to the presidency? We used to sit around our dinner table at night, not every night, but many nights, and I think Mike would agree with this. Dad would tell these wonderful stories of his life in West Michigan, how he grew up in Grand Rapids, and all the people that invested in his life. And we would hear these names, Ducky Pond from Yale, when he was a coach at Yale and got Dad a job. Coach Kipke at Michigan, when he played at Michigan. Ralph Conger was a name that jumped out. Ralph Conger, back then, was the basketball coach at Central High School. And there was a critical moment in Dad's life where he had a choice. He could either go to South High or Central. And Dad's father wanted to know which was the best high school for Dad to go to. And so they went to Ralph Conger, the basketball coach at Central. And Ralph Conger told him right away, he says, you got to go to South. It's the most racially diverse. He'll get the greatest social education that he could get. He'll get a great book study education too. And sure enough, Gleaves, you had a program the other night about fair housing, and there's no doubt in my mind that that decision to go to South High, racially diverse, impacted Dad's congressional career and his voting many years later. 1964, the Civil Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, all those kind of things came from that decision when he was just a young kid getting ready to go to high school. That's the investment that people in Grand Rapids and West Michigan made into my dad's life. And we're going to touch on some of those things. Now, the biggest, the one that had the greatest impact would have been this woman right here. This was Dad's mother, Dorothy. There's Dad as just a young baby. Sadly, Dorothy married a man. A lot of you in the audience may not know this. My dad's original name was Leslie King. It was not Gerald R. Ford. He was born, well, let me tell you the story. Dorothy married a man named Leslie King. And sadly, I'm going to quote, there's two great books out about Dad. Richard Norton Smith's book recently, and years ago, Jim Cannon wrote a book, and I'm going to read out of Jim Cannon's book for those of you who don't know this story. Leslie King, that would have been Dorothy's first husband. Leslie King first struck his beautiful young bride on their honeymoon. It happened in the new and elegant Monmouth Hotel in Portland, Oregon on September 27, 1912. The groom and his new wife, Dorothy Gardner King, were on the elevator when a man stepped in and took off his hat, as was then the custom. She nodded slightly to acknowledge the stranger's courtesy. As the newlyweds walked away from the elevator through a marble and crystal reception ring, King accused her of flirting. In tears, she said she was just being polite, responding to a gentleman's good manners as any lady should. Her denial only made him more angry. The new bride, according to court documents filed later, became enraged and set upon her, called her vile and insulting names, struck and slapped her in the face and about the head. She was 20 years old, a bride of 3 weeks in a strange city, frightened and far from home. The beatings continue. It says here later, 5 days later, in their private room on a Pullman car from San Francisco to Los Angeles, King again struck and kicked his bride. And then Jim Cannon writes here, on Monday, July 14th, 1913, the hottest day of the year in Omaha, Dorothy Gardner King gave birth to a son. He was to become the 38th President of the United States. At the father's insistence, the child was given the name Leslie L. King, Jr. So that's how Dad came into this world, and you wouldn't look at that story and say, wow, he's going to be President of the United States someday. But thankfully, the strongest person in his life was his mother, Dorothy. Can you imagine? The beatings continued. Her husband finally came at her with a butcher knife. She fled in the middle of the night from Omaha, Nebraska with Dad as just a child baby, crossed the river to Council Bluffs, Iowa, hid out for several days until her father and family came down from Chicago, picked her up, took her back to Chicago. She got a divorce in 1913. Women didn't get a divorce in 1913. I mean, the question would have been asked, what'd you do to make him beat you? That was the mentality back then. That tells you how strong a woman Dorothy was, his mother. Well, she gets a divorce. She moves to Grand Rapids, Michigan, and she meets a wonderful man, Gerald R. Ford. That's him on the left. That's a picture of Dad in the middle. His three stepbrothers, Uncle Jim, Uncle Dick. What do we have? Dick, Jim, and Tom. And Dad is the oldest in the middle. Grandpa Ford is the man that took Dad under his wing and invested in his life. Made sure he had the right church pastor, the right first grade teacher, the right football coach, the right Boy Scout leader. Scoutmaster Kendall, who, when Dad became an Eagle Scout, and it proved to me the wonderful story about Dad, and it's covered in Jim's book and Richard's book, is how all these people invested in his life at a critical moment. And the wonderful thing about Grandpa Ford, his stepfather, it proved that it is love, not blood, that raises kids. Because Grandpa Ford was not a blood relative of my father's. He made a choice to invest in Dad's life. And we're so grateful that he did. Here's a picture of Dad when he was an Eagle Scout up at Mackinac Island. Spent the summer up there as an Eagle Scout. I'm going to go back just a second. My favorite story about Dad and the people that invested in his life was his principal at South High, Principal Krause. Dad was graduating from high school, and Principal Krause called him in and said, Jerry, now that you're going to get out of high school, what are you going to do? And my dad said, well, I can't go to college. We don't have any money. The Ford family was struggling then. They were moving around. They were having a tough time. This was the Depression. And Principal Krause said to him, Jerry, I want you to go 1 year, at least 1 year, to the University of Michigan. Dad said, we can't afford it. And Principal Krause said, I'll tell you what, our school bookstores made some money, and we're going to take some of that money and start a scholarship, and you're going to be the first recipient. And he says, we're going to give you $100 so you can go 1 year to the University of Michigan. Is that not the cost anymore? Okay. But $100 got you 1 year at Michigan back in the late 20s. And that man changed my father's life. Can you imagine if he doesn't get to college? There's no way he becomes president of the United States. So he gets to Michigan, and he plays for Coach Kipke. There's no scholarships. He gets a job, goes to school, plays football. Dad played on 2 national championship football teams, 1932 and 1933. 10-0, both seasons, Michigan was. In 1934, he was voted most valuable player. This is a picture of him on the Michigan football team in 1934. He's number 48 in the middle there. In 1934, Michigan is supposed to play a team, Georgia Tech. Georgia Tech is an all-white school in 1934. Georgia Tech finds out that Michigan has one black player on his team, number 61, Willis Ward, up in the left-hand corner. Dad and Willis Ward were best of friends. They roomed together when the team traveled. Georgia Tech says they will not take the field, they will not play that game if Willis Ward suits up for that game. Now, this isn't about Georgia Tech. This is what all the schools did back then during the Jim Crow laws. The northern schools would bench their black players so the southern schools would come up and play them. Well, this was a challenge of character for Dad and several members of that Michigan football team. They heard about Willis Ward going to be benched, and they were going to make, Dad and several other players were going to make a statement and quit the University of Michigan football team to make a stand for their good friend Willis Ward. Now, this is 1934. Willis heard about it. He went to Dad and several of the other players and said, guys, you got to play. I'll sit down. I won't play. Now, remember, Michigan had come off two undefeated seasons, 10-0 national champions. In 1934, their record was 1-8. They won one game and lost 8. But the only team they beat was Georgia Tech. Now, I heard, your Dad didn't tell that story. He didn't wear that story on his sleeve. I heard that story, I had tears in my eyes. Can you imagine a 20-year-old kid? I mean, what is character? Character is what you do when nobody's watching. And nobody was watching Dad and some of those players that were willing to make a stand for their good friend Willis Ward. Now, Dad left the University of Michigan. Coach Kipke got him an interview with Ducky Pond, who was at Yale. Dad wanted to go to Yale, go to law school, but he couldn't get in Yale right away, so he had to find a job, get there. And Ducky Pond, the famous coach at Yale, told Dad that he would give him a job coaching football, but in the winter, later in the winter, he'd have to coach boxing. And he asked Dad if he knew how to coach boxing. Dad said, no, I don't know anything about boxing, but I can learn. And so before he went to Yale, he came back to Grand Rapids and went down to the local YMCA and spent all summer learning how to box so he could go back to Yale and fulfill his commitment to coach football and boxing at Yale. He graduated from Yale Law School, came back and started a small practice here with his good friend, Phil Buchan. And one Sunday afternoon, Dad was kind of cleaning off his desk on a Sunday afternoon, and he tells the story how he got in the car to go home. He turned on the radio, and it was December 7th, 1941, and he heard on the radio that Pearl Harbor had been bombed. And he immediately turned the car around and headed to his parents' house, sat down with his parents and said, tomorrow morning, Monday morning, I'm going to go join the service. And sure enough, Monday morning, he went and joined the Navy, went in and became an officer, lieutenant commander on an aircraft carrier in the South Pacific, the USS Monterey. The captain of that ship, Captain Hunt, invested again in Dad's life, made him a better officer and looked after him. The thing about World War II was it changed Dad politically. He went to fight in the war as just your good, solid Midwest isolationist. And after several years in the war and seeing what America had to do to lead to free the world, he came back an internationalist. And he came back to Grand Rapids, started in law again, but he got the itch politically and decided to run locally. And this was a campaign poster he had. He came back to Grand Rapids, and Grand Rapids had a congressman who'd been here about 10 years, Bartel Yonkman, entrenched, isolationist. And Dad came back and ran against him and knew if he could beat him in the primary, he would win the election in the fall. So he beat him in the primary, wins the election in the fall, and goes back to Washington, D.C. as a young congressman from West Michigan. Now, I'm going to fast forward here about 25 years, and we're going to cut. Now, Dad went on to be the House Minority Leader. He went on to be the House Minority Leader, and he spent about 25 years in Congress. Now, my mother hated politics. I can tell you that. She tolerated it, but she was ready for him to quit. And his goal was he wanted to be Speaker of the House. And they never got a majority in Republicans in Congress, so he could be Speaker of the House. So he told my mom, he says, we don't win this next election and get a majority and I'm Speaker, we'll retire and go back to Grand Rapids. And so she was excited about his retirement. But let me show you a picture of a man who changed all that for us. This is a picture of Spiro Agnew. And Dad was getting ready to retire, and all of a sudden, Nixon's Vice President, Spiro Agnew, got caught in a bribery scandal and had to step down from office. Dad's name was on a list of 3 or 4 people that Nixon might pick as his next vice president. And that list would have had Nelson Rockefeller, the former liberal governor, Republican, but more liberal of New York, John Connally, who had been the Democratic governor of Texas, who'd switched to the Republican Party, he was on that list, and Jerry Ford, the House Minority Leader from West Michigan. Now, Nixon had to make a choice, and leaders of Congress, Democratic leaders of Congress, Carl Albert, who was a Democratic Speaker of the House, and Mike Mansfield, the Democrat in the Senate who had leadership, Nixon called them in to ask them who they thought he should nominate to be the next vice president. Now, Nixon really wanted Connally. That was maybe his first choice. But the Democratic leadership were so mad Connally had switched parties, they told him, Mr. President, you're not going to get John Connally confirmed. There's going to be a bloodbath in Congress trying to get John Connally confirmed. And he asked them, well, who can I get through Congress? And they said, Jerry Ford. His integrity, his character, he'll reach across the aisle, he'll find a way to compromise and keep government moving. And so that night, we were waiting. We didn't take Dad's nomination very seriously. We thought it'd be Rockefeller or Connally. So that night, we're waiting in our house in Alexandria, Virginia. We lived in a little 4-bedroom house there. And to put this story in perspective, we had 2 different telephone lines in our house. One was a public line listed in the phone book, 3 or 4 extensions throughout the house. And the other was a private line in my parents' bedroom that was unlisted, only 1 extension. And we're having dinner. It's Mom and Dad, my sister Susan, me. I think Mike and Jack were away at college. And the phone rings in my parents' bedroom, the private line. My sister picks up the phone, yells downstairs, Dad, it's the White House. We go upstairs, and Dad picks up the phone. And on the other end of that phone is General Alexander Haig, who was Nixon's chief of staff. And he says, Congressman Ford, the President of the United States has something he thinks both you and your wife, Betty, should hear at the same time. Can you put your wife, Betty, on? And before my dad could tell General Haig there was only 1 extension, the President of the United States gets on the phone. And the next thing we hear my dad say is, Mr. President, if you could call back on the other line, Betty could get on, and he hangs up. Now, I tell you, I was 17 years old, so even I was bright enough to know that was not a career move, right? I had visions of what if that White House operator doesn't know the other number, right? We sat there, honestly, for 5 minutes, got very still, very quiet. And finally, thank God, the President of the United States calls back on the other line where my mother could get on the phone and they could share that moment together in their marriage. Well, that was in October of 1973. Dad becomes vice president. We all know our history, and over the next 10 months, the Nixon presidency was under siege. And 10 months later, this is a famous picture of Dad and Mom walking the Nixons out on the south lawn of the White House. And I think everybody in this room has seen in school books and everywhere the iconic picture of Richard Nixon saying goodbye to his staff, family, friends on the south lawn of the White House. People backed off, Mom and Dad, the helicopter took off and went to Andrews Air Force Base to fly Nixon to the West Coast. We went back in the White House where Dad was going to take the oath of office, put his hand on the Bible. Now think about this. Think about what he was walking into, what he inherited. Here was a man who's going to become president of the United States that had not been elected by the American people. He'd not been on a ticket with Nixon. He was the first man to become president without going through an election. This was a constitutional crisis, and I expect this panel over here to fill you in on some more of the details. But we were going to walk in, and Dad was going to take the oath of office. There was a Vietnam War, a recession. I'm going to back up even more. 12 months before Nixon resigned, the price of a barrel of oil on the free market was $3 to $4 a barrel. In the next 12 months, the price of oil went from $3 to $4 a barrel to $12 a barrel. That's a 300% to 400% increase in the price of oil. The stock market, 6 months before Nixon resigned, was hovering just over 1,000 points. In the next 6 months, it lost 40%, over 40% of its value. There was a war in Vietnam, Cold War with the Russians, energy crisis, recession, unemployment was getting over 7-8%. Inflation was close to double digit, would eventually get to 14%. This was the presidency that Gerald Ford was going to inherit. We walked into the East Room of the White House, and Mom held the Bible, and Dad took the oath of office. This is the kids sitting in the front row, all the kids. This was our first picture behind the Oval Office desk. Nixon had cleared off his desk the night before, and we walked into the Oval Office. That's Jack on the end, myself, Mom, Dad, Susan, Mike's wife, Gail, and Mike on the right side there. Now, this... You would think you get to move in the White House right after your dad becomes president of the United States. No. Nixon left so quickly, so unexpectedly, they couldn't pack up all their belongings. So they left their daughter and son-in-law to pack. It took 7 days to pack up all their belongings. So that night, after that picture, we have to go back to our little house in suburbia and for the next 7 days. And this is a picture of our first meal after Dad becomes president. And you ladies out there, gosh, I'll never forget. My mom standing over the stove that night cooking, going, Jerry, you just became president of the United States, and I'm still cooking. So that was our life for the next 7 days. Well, you heard what Dad inherited, and it was a tough time to be a president of this country. Even though, Dad was only in office 2.5 years, but even though when he left office, all the troops in Vietnam were home, the Dow Jones was back over 1,000 points, regained all it lost. They'd cut inflation from 14% down to 4.5%. Unemployment was going down. All these good things that happened. The country was rolling again, but that's not what he's remembered for, right? I'm going to let Carla Hills and some of these others talk. Deregulation. They were deregulating the financial institution, the banks, the railroads. A lot of good things were happening, but that's not what he's remembered for, right? What's his legacy? The Nixon pardon. And if he were here today, he would tell you, I'm fine with that. that's fine for him. He would feel comfortable with that. And let me say a few words about the pardon, and then we're going to have the panel come up. I think Dad knew he had to do something when the leaders, both Democrat and Republican leaders, came to the White House and said, Mr. President, we're spending 10 to 20% of our everyday still dealing with Richard Nixon. He's out of office. There were still criminal charges pending. He called in Leon Jaworski, and he wanted to find out how long Nixon could drag this out in the courts. And Leon Jaworski, the special prosecutor, said, yeah, Nixon could drag this out in the courts 3, 4, 5 years maybe, these legal. And now, I think that was the moment that pushed Dad. There was only one person that could clear the deck. He's the only one that had the power of the pardon to clear the deck, get Nixon out of the way so that the country could heal and move on to dealing with the recession, the Vietnam War, those kind of things. So they knew they could not get Richard Nixon to say he did anything wrong. That was not going to happen. Now, later it came out in all his books. So they found a Supreme Court case. It's called the Burdick case from 1915. And the Burdick case was, the federal government had charges against a man named Mr. Burdick. And they told him, we'll give you a pardon if you'll testify for us. And Mr. Burdick said, I'm not going to testify for you because I don't think I did anything wrong. I didn't break a law. Because the Supreme Court had ruled that by granting a pardon, it was an implication of guilt. And if you accepted that pardon, it was an acceptance of guilt. So they went to Nixon, Benton Becker, who was Dad's attorney he sent to California. They went to Nixon in California and his staff and people, and they said, we're going to grant a pardon, but it's under the conditions of the Burdick case. That there's an assumption of guilt, and if the ex-president accepts the pardon, there's an acceptance of that guilt. Nixon initially turned it down. Days later, came back around and said he'd accept it under those conditions. Now, Dad, I would tell you, Dad was thinking long-term, not short-term. His staff told him, Mr. President, if you run for re-election, the pardon's going to crush you. You're going to lose 7 to 15% of the vote. He lost to Carter by less than 1%. But he didn't care. He was a public servant, and he thought a public servant should be worried about serving the public, healing a nation, not getting reelected. Dad always said, a politician worries about the next election, a statesman worries about the next generation. And he was thinking long-term, not short-term, to fix his political career. Now, he gave the pardon, all hell broke loose. Democrats, Republicans, the country was mad. He immediately called the leaders in Congress and said, I'll come in front of the House Judiciary Committee, I'll testify, I'll clear my day, I'll clear my week if you need me a week to testify. And this is a famous picture of him in front of the House Judiciary Committee answering questions about the pardon. And I asked Dad once, I said, why'd you, he said, I trusted the process. I trusted my colleagues, both Democrats and Republicans. These are people he had served with for decades, and he thought he'd get a fair shake. And he spent that, can you imagine what that must have felt like? Now, at the same time, and I want to say about this, that's the first time, he was the first president since Abraham Lincoln that voluntarily, through his own volition, had volunteered to appear in front of Congress without a subpoena, since Abraham Lincoln. That's the transparency he wanted. Same time, he gave the pardon to Nixon to sort of heal over the wounds of Watergate. He also gave a conditional amnesty to the draft dodgers that had left service, not gone to service in Vietnam. And where did he choose to give that speech? Because he knew how much it meant. He went in front of the veterans of foreign wars. That was not the easy place to give that speech, but he was trying to heal the wounds of Vietnam and bring people home. And on the car over, he told my mother was riding in the car, and he says, Betty, I think we're going to get home on time today. There won't be much applause today. But that's the kind of man he was. He wanted to shoot straight, be transparent, and so that is who Dad was. And I'm going to now close here, but I want to say that it came full circle, because 20 years after Dad left office, he got invited to the John F. Kennedy Museum and Library by Caroline Kennedy and Senator Ted Kennedy. And he got the JFK Award for Profiles in Courage because of the Nixon pardon. And this is long-term, not short-term. And Ted Kennedy basically said, Mr. President, 20 years ago I told the country you sold it out. I stand here today corrected. You did the courageous thing, heal a nation. And that's who my father was. It wasn't about getting reelected. It was about being a public servant. Thank you all very, very, very much.
Steve, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. Well done. I mean, that was well done. That's right. Really, look, he got a pat on the back from his older brother. Well, let's get right to it. We have the opportunity now to explore some of the themes that Steve introduced. From your left to right, we have in alphabetical order. We have Mike Ford, who's the oldest son of Jerry and Betty Ford. He had a very distinguished career at Wake Forest University. During that 34 years, he had a number of leadership positions there. And so, with that academic background, we sometimes have a rivalry with the University of Michigan. We forgive him for that. Then, of course, Steve, who we've already met. Then Secretary Carla Hills. Carla Hills is the chair and CEO of Hills International Consultants. And she talks to groups all over the world, consulting, business groups, entrepreneurial groups, how to do business abroad, what are the implications. But we know her here in this building because she was the secretary of HUD, of Housing and Urban Development. And for those of you who keep score, she's only the third woman who ever served in a presidential cabinet. Yeah. And then closest to me is General Al Zapanta, and General Zapanta is also a very distinguished member of the Ford alumni group. He was the first person who, the first Latino who was Senate confirmed and served as the Assistant Secretary of the Interior in the Ford administration. And he also had, the number of medals that this soldier patriot has earned from the battlefield, and in fact he's wearing one of them tonight, is staggering. It's more than 30 medals, combat experience and all. So thank you so much for that. Okay. Thank you very much. Well, let's get to it after that. First of all, I'd like to know what your responses were. You knew President Ford in a very special way, Mike, you especially. So what's your response to what you saw?
Well, I'll get started being the older brother to first commend my brother Steve, who made a wonderful, I guess, review and kind of life sketch of my dad, our dad. I've seen those pictures, know those stories, and every time I see that, it brings a lot of emotion, a lot of sense of pride and sense of gratitude for being the son of Jerry and Betty Ford, and things that Steve shared about their leadership in our family are all spot on. So thank you, Steve. It's really meaningful to me. I did want to say a comment about how Jerry Ford kind of evolved in terms of his calling. I call it a calling. I've got that ministerial degree, and so I know how God works in our lives, or I believe that. But his calling to public service, because as Steve kind of traced through his childhood and his growth into a young adult and then adult, there were these investments, of significant others, starting with his stepfather and his mother Dorothy, and I kind of saw to me it's how God was working through those individuals to kind of build a foundation into my dad's life of a certain set of values, a certain set of ideals, a certain way of engaging the world. And, starting with my grandparents, they, what is it? They always told their children to tell the truth, work hard, and show up on time for dinner. That was the three rules in the household, and that kind of captured, the way they parented and the way they had, not only loved their children, all four of them, but ran a pretty tight ship, in the Ford household, and they had high expectations for all four of their boys. And the thing that was remarkable is, I thought, that my grandparents were, right from the get-go, they themselves were very much committed to the city of Grand Rapids and to this community. And they were leaders in various civic organizations, and they were business. He was a business leader, and leaders in their church. And so this was the life that my dad, was brought into, was the parents who really had a very sense of service and community, and wanted to better this place. And so he, as the oldest, was held to a high standard. So there was that family unit. There was the start of his calling for public service. And then he learned things along the way through the Boy Scouts, how to honor our country and serve our community. And that, as an Eagle Scout, he took that very seriously. And then was he at South High and University of Michigan, very involved as not only a wonderful, great athlete and leader on the football field, but he was also a leader in the classroom, and in he was a honor society scholar. And so he had this way of coming into a role of, as he matured, to be making positive change, bring, the community along, bring the team along, bring the family along. And this was, something that I'm sure part of it was his own makeup, but a lot of it was the ways in which his family, West Michigan, University of Michigan, the U.S. Navy, all those institutions really reinforced and gave him this sense of calling to be able to do the hard work of being president and make those decisions that were maybe not politically the best things, but were done for the greatest good of America and the country at that time. So public service was just given to him in so many ways, and I'm really grateful for that.
Carla, what's your response to what we saw in those slides?
I think that President Ford brought to the office enormous skill about government, but also about character. He was elected to be a minority leader as a Republican in a democratically controlled Congress. And he was the most bipartisan president that I have ever seen. But when Nixon knew that he had to replace Agnew, he called his friends in the Congress, because under the 25th Amendment, Congress has to approve who is appointed to be vice president. He was told that nobody except Ford could be confirmed in this Congress. And so President Nixon appointed him. And he brought to the office the ability to listen. He believed in bipartisanship and in sharing the arguments on the other side, both internationally and locally. He was willing to compromise. He used to say, good government requires communications, and you must be willing to be conciliatory. You've got to cooperate, and you must compromise. And we certainly experienced that throughout the administration. We received bills at a time when we had double-digit inflation that he knew would cost the American people and their economy a great deal, and really a tragic outcome. In my area of housing, we had the emergency housing bill of 1975, and that would have subsidized mortgages for everyone in this room, regardless of income. And he said, we can't do that. We don't have the funds to do that. And so what did we do? We went back to, he vetoed it, and we went back to Congress and sat down with the Democrats. Lud Ashley was a star in that, and came up with a bill that would subsidize mortgages for the lowest quintile and have a sunset provision at the end of the year. That went through Congress very well and got the American public to applaud. So similarly with international activities, he was willing to sit and listen. And when a cabinet member had a debate, for example, with the Office of Management and Budget, who handled the budget, and objected to the program that they were presenting, it was President Ford who would sit across in the cabinet table with just the two people who were arguing and listened to the arguments on both sides. And I have to tell you, as an old litigator, that he asked better questions than any judge I have ever tried a case in front of. And then he would make a decision. And so we were really blessed with a manager, someone who was kind and thoughtful. When he was out of town, he would call me and my husband, who was then head of the Securities and Exchange Commission, and say, you guys are working so hard. We're going to be out of town. The president's box at the Kennedy Center is open. Go use it. And so he was thoughtful and really a wonderful president that governed in a period of time that is a little bit similar to what we have in terms of challenges. Economically, we had the Vietnam War, we had tensions in the Middle East, which is what really drove up the cost of energy. And we had tensions with the Soviet Union as to who they were going to work with. And he was able to navigate that and appoint people to go and talk to them that had the experience to make a difference. And every night when I go to bed, I think, please send us someone like Gerald Ford.
Al, what do you think?
Well, I'm going to take a little personal time about what I was able to experience with Gerald R. Ford. 1973, 74, I was a White House fellow, and I had come out of the Vietnam War 4 years prior. And so at that point, my year as a White House fellow, which I was also the special assistant to the Secretary of Transportation, where we were experiencing the trucking problems. The 7 Northeast railroads were broke and trying to fix those, and it was all impacted by the oil embargo. So you brought it up, and you remember that. But during my year, it starts September and it ends at the end of August. And so comes August 8th and 9 of 1974, at the end of my year, you saw what the history is. So I was asked to stay on as part of the advance team, and there were 4 of us. I was the new guy in. There were 2 White House fellows that were asked to stay on for that period of time during President Ford's next 2 years. And so I did, and one of the highlights that was also, thank God, it turned out right. I was the advance man in Sacramento when Squeaky Fromm tried to assassinate Gerald R. Ford. And as that was happening, the Secret Service fellow by the name of Boondorf, his last name, and any of you that were military at one time know that a .45, you can stop it from firing 3 different ways. One is the regular safety, the other is the detent. You hit it at the front end and it stops it. And then, of course, you can jam your hand into the hammer so it doesn't strike the pin. And that's what he did. He was that fast and was able to rip it off of her. But what I really want to tell you, what was interesting, from the minute that they said gun, and I'm standing between and to the rear of the president and Donald Rumsfeld. And so automatically we take off running, because we were about 100 meters away from going into the capital of Sacramento so that the president would sit with Jerry Brown, thank you. So I got Ford in my mind, right? He walked in and never once, and Jerry Brown didn't even know what had just happened 5 minutes, 10 minutes prior. And they had their meeting and it was over. He was told, I'm sure, after, and the president walked out. That's the kind of man Jerry Ford was. You never knew that he was under any kind of strain or pressure. He would hold it and did it. So that was my first personal session with the president. The next one was actually, I think it may have been right after. Myself and Terry O'Donnell were sitting right out about midnight at the Oval Office getting ready for the next trip that I was going to handle in California. And Donald Rumsfeld and Mike, I mean, not Mike, but Cheney and Rumsfeld came in and said, the president's still in? Yes. So they walk in. They're in there about 30 minutes. And I'm not sure any of you know this, but this was really something for me because I want you all to know really how deep a man this is. They come out, don't say a word to us, and Terry and I are looking at each other. And about 30 minutes later, the president walks out and looks very serious. He says, Julie Nixon just got off the phone with me. Does not feel that the president can last much longer. And you know what happened the next day. Gerald R. Ford pardoned Richard Nixon. So I will tell you, I believe in my heart, he did it for not only, he understood the politics, he understood what had to happen, but he did it because he wanted to be who he really is, who all of you are, that humanitarian Midwesterner, and I mean it. And I want you to know that. To switch into a more happy time. We're in California a month later, and I'm in the back with him, just he and I in the limousine going to Pomona, California. And we passed where I grew up in East Los Angeles, where also my father, and by the way, he started chuckling with me on, he has a great sense of humor. It's kind of dry at times. But I said, you know, Mr. President, I grew up right up on that hill. He says, yeah, Al, really? Well, tell me more about your family. So I started to tell him a little bit more about my family. I said, you know, my father played football at the University of Southern California. And of course, that's all I had to say. Right? So he says, really? I says, yeah, he was the very first ever Mexican-American that got a full scholarship in 1935 from an East LA college, or no, high school called Garfield, to go to the University of California, Southern California on a football and track scholarship. And I said, you know, Mr. President, and the first thing he asked me, so, well, what position did he play? Right? Yeah. I said, well, no, he played halfback, okay? And I said, he played in the 1939 Rose Bowl against Duke, and they beat him. And he looked at me and he says, Al, I've always wanted to play in the Rose Bowl. Kind of talk about a little bit of the history of how, but I tell you that because I come away with a president that is somebody that we need right now for our country, because we are such a polarization. And what we have running, I'm having a heck of a time trying to figure out what I want to do. I'm going to vote, I will tell you that. But you probably know which way I'm going to vote anyway, so I'm not going to even go there. The thing that I really believe at this point, we're at a time in our country that it's time for our American people that you are sitting out there to vote and pick how we're going as a country. And that's who Jerry Ford was, and that's what has impacted me all my life and why I still am in the public sector and doing the things that I do in both. And why I like coming here, by the way, you have the cleanest city in the country. Of 54 years, by the way, she waited till I came back from Vietnam, from Maine, always remarks, God, that's such a great city. She liked it here. And so, and I've been up here for quite a few times. But I wanted you to get a personal opinion of a guy that saw and felt your president, my president, in a way that we all have those relationships, we all have those sensitivities. But for him to make a decision in our 200-year bicentennial to put Al Zapanta, a Mexican-American from East Los Angeles, to be the first in a president's cabinet officer as an Assistant Secretary of Interior. That's the kind of person, and there's no doubt in my mind, he thought about it and came to that realization. So I just want you to know that. And maybe he remembered what he asked me. He says, well, tell me more about your family. I said, well, Mr. President, my mother was born in El Paso, Texas. My father was born in Los Angeles. My family settled Tucson, Arizona. And so the border crossed our family. We never crossed the border. And he loved it. He says, Al, so I just needed to be personal with you, because at the end of the day, there's a very special memory that I have that has impacted my life and who I am today. Thank you.
What a start. I've got to confess that I wore special socks today, just in case they didn't know what to say and they needed a little channeling, and I don't think I needed to show them the sock. No, you guys really have started this off very meaningfully. Let's open it up to the audience. I'm sure some of you have questions. So let's, I think, sir, yeah, Chip?
Mrs. Hills, I want to ask you about someone who worked in the White House and was tied back into here. Jim Kratzis, who was the director of the museum before
I can't hear him.
now. Do I have to speak a little louder?
Yeah, a little louder.
Okay. Jim Kratzis and I were taking Ben Stein around the museum. Ben Stein, you'll know on a lot of other things, but he was in Ferris Bueller's Day Off. We went into the area where the picture of President Ford being sworn in is. Ben looked at that picture and started crying. We said, Jim Kratzis said, what's the matter? And he said, that's my mother and dad sitting there. And he said, I am so happy. They passed last year. I am so happy that he got the chance to work for President Gerald R. Ford. Do you know the Steins?
Do you know Ben Stein's parents? Do you know Ben Stein?
I do not know Ben Stein's parents, no.
He was
But
an advisor.
if he had the opportunity to work for George Herbert Walker Bush, it was a wonderful opportunity, because again, I think of him as well as President Ford being the two best presidents we've had in our lifetimes.
One more question. Yes, ma'am.
How did his Christian faith influence his presidency?
I'd like to take a stab at that. Grace and mercy was much of, I think, General, you were talking about that in the pardon. There was a grace and mercy tone to that pardon, and it was finally done. Dad, I asked him about the pardon one time, and he told me that a president sometimes has to be like a father of a family. And when you get a kid that gets out of line and breaks the rules, there's repercussions and things you got to pay the price. And a father, he was probably talking about me, but a father has a choice he can make. Can he carry out the full extent of those rules and punish that child? But if he thinks it's going to rip the family apart, he gives grace and mercy to hold the whole family together. And Dad could have let Nixon, go through the whole process and felt the full impact of the hammer of justice and the law and Congress. But I got the impression that he wanted to have some grace and mercy. I mean, if you get grace and mercy, you're guilty. You don't get grace and mercy when you're not guilty. And I think he realized that his faith, he understood that concept of grace and mercy in his own Christian faith. So that'd be my guess.
Yeah, let me add a little bit. Steve is talked about his sense of my dad's sense of compassion and justice and yet mercy. But, in his youth, his mother, Dorothy, very strong Christian woman, and his stepfather too, and they, kind of poured their faith experience into him and into his three brothers. And one of the, his life, I guess, passage was one that, from the scriptures that Dorothy actually gave him, was from Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. And when he was sworn in on August 9th, 1974, the Bible was open, our family Bible, and he put his palm, and swore in as president on, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not unto your own understanding, and God will direct your path. And so he had a deep faith in God Almighty and in the person of Christ. And during the election with Jimmy Carter, Jimmy was a born again Christian, and that was something that Dad was hard, to come out and, kind of wear his Christian faith on his sleeve, and yet it was very much a part of his life. And the beautiful thing about, those two men is they did, challenge each other in the 1976 presidential race. They had both were seeking to be president, and they had some differences, and yet through that pretty rugged campaign, presidential campaign, they had a lot of respect for each other, and never said, I would say, dismissive or even ugly things about each other. It was all there. And then as time, they finished their terms, they grew to be very, very dear friends, and deep friends, and also did many things for each other. In fact, President Carter spoke at my dad's, funeral. So that Christian faith, bound them together as two human beings and former presidents. Yeah.
Secretary Hills, I think you wanted to add.
I would add, in addition to the grace and mercy, which I agree with, and all the points that have been made, is that the giving of the pardon was hugely controversial. He was accused in the newspapers of selling the safety that he gave to Nixon through the pardon for the role of graduating to be president. But what he said to the cabinet, and what is actually factual, is that he knew at the time that the pardon would cost him the election. And in fact, he said, if I had not pardoned Nixon, we would have been in litigation for over 5 years, and our nation cannot stand to be so distracted at a time when we have economic problems as tough as we're confronting today, with double-digit inflation, very high unemployment, and foreign policy issues, to be looking so disorganized. We cannot tolerate that. I think it's a lesson that should come back and haunt us today.
Secretary Zapanta, you want to add anything?
No, I think I've said it all. I think you pretty well know my view of the president. And I'm really very, very proud to be here with you, because it's a very, very proud time in my life, and to be with the family and my dear friend.
Yeah.
Glees, I'd like to, first of all, as a family member, thank you all for coming. This means a great deal to the Ford family. We're talking about a lot about Dad, I do want to say one thing about Mom. I'll never forget when he decided, he accepted the vice presidency. My mother was not happy. She thought he was going to retire and come back to Grand Rapids and open a law firm, and all of a sudden he's back in the thick of things. He's going to be vice president. I'll never forget my dad putting his arm around my mother and saying, "Don't worry, Betty, vice presidents don't do anything."
That's a good ending.
So it didn't really work out that way. So, yeah.
Oh, gosh. Well, on that humorous note on your mom and your dad, I think let's give them a hand. And we have a real treat because now part 2 of the evening is just about to begin. We're going to have the sneak preview of this fine exhibit. So we're all going to go out into the lobby, and a few of us will get on the stairs, I guess, with scissors, and we'll have a ribbon cutting. So thank you very much, everybody.